You are indeed watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side Live. I'm one of your hosts, Eugene Perrier, here once again alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, as always, it's an honor to be, well, not next to you, but next to you virtually.
It's always great to be on with you, Eugene. It's the biggest privilege of my life.
Wow, that's... I don't know if that's good or bad, honestly. I'm flattered either way.
Well, you're welcome.
Thank you. Of course. The pleasure's all mine or something. I don't know. Anyway, long story short, welcome back to the show. Happy to have everybody here. We got a great show, as we always do. We're going around the world and back again. We're touching a range of different stories from Pakistan to the United States, political prisoners in the United States, and the struggle of teachers in the United States. We're going to be talking about, ongoing campaigns of political assassinations in South Africa, Starbucks workers organizing in Los Angeles. We've got a whole new segment that we're debuting later in the show today. So there's a lot here, a lot to be said, a lot for you to follow, and a lot for anyone who follows you to also see. So I would say now is as good a time as any for you to, share the link to this, send out a smoke signal, carrier pigeon, yell at someone in the next room, whatever is required, so that whoever is following you or is within the sound of your voice can be following us here on the show. And for everybody who's watching on YouTube, of course, this is also a good time for you to hit the subscribe button. Also hit the bell so you can get the alerts. So all the fantastic things, including dispatches from Rania Khalek from Breakthrough News, will be delivered directly to you in a sense. You won't have to go looking for it. So hit subscribe, but also hit the bell so you get the alerts so you can stay on top of everything that we are doing here at Breakthrough News. And of course, don't forget that just below the screen, I guess is the best way to say it, you can make a donation here live in the show, or you should be able to. Hopefully we're there. Full disclosure, I can't see the screen, so
I see it. I can confirm that you can in fact donate. I'm looking at it right now.
Good. I'm certainly very glad. Not because I didn't want to say something wrong, but I do want people to donate. Obviously, nothing's too small. Also, nothing's too large. So
yeah,
whatever.
Definitely nothing too large. That's
definitely
true.
nothing too large.
No limits,
at all.
You guys.
There's zero upper limit to what you can donate. $1 million, $1 billion, $1 trillion. It's all live, as it were. So thank you for that in advance. But yeah, make sure you donate. Make sure you subscribe. Make sure you hit the bell. And, we'll do the best we can here at Breakthrough News. Just waiting to see if our first guest is here. We want to turn relatively...
Before we get too excited and start having a conversation.
I don't want to have a whole conversation and then have someone join.
Exactly. That's not about what we're going to talk to them about. But I do want to reiterate what Eugene said, is you can absolutely now donate directly. But I think are we still doing super chats?
You actually can't do both at the same time.
Oh, that's YouTube. That's not cool. Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm going to have to, I want to speak to the manager. I'm going to have to speak to the manager.
That there's probably no one you can even call. It's just like one of those online forms, where it's like, enter your name, enter your email. Anytime I see one of those, I usually just like don't submit any form of comment because those things aren't. No one gets back to you.
Can I use this as an opportunity to plug an episode of Dispatches?
I'd love for you to plug an episode of Dispatches.
A couple minutes here. Well, you guys, after you're finishing watching this excellent live stream, because we do have like a really great lineup of guests and topics, you should go watch my latest episode of Dispatches, which went up yesterday it was a crossover episode with host of the Socialist Program, Brian Becker. And we had a really long and amazing conversation about the history of violence and repression against the American left. Because, everyone's always like, oh, the left is so weak and so small and dysfunctional. Constantly that's like the conversation on the internet, at least, which I don't entirely agree with, by the way. But it's true that the left is indeed much weaker today than it was, 50, 100 years ago, for sure. There's a reason for that. It's not an accident. It's not a coincidence. And we talk a lot about that as well as other stuff. And Brian is just like a fountain of knowledge about that history. So do go check that out, because it's seriously like one of my favorite episodes of Dispatches that I've ever recorded. Also because Brian's awesome. So
Yeah, well, and I love that we have a crossover there with the Socialist Program, also a fantastic show, but that sounds very interesting. And I would say, Ron, you're very of the moment because, of course, there's all this conversation that's out there about, the history of the various repressive entities and institutions, the FBI, the cops in general, so on and so forth. So certainly I think some of this history of the people who have really been targeted in a serious way by state repression certainly deserve to be mentioned, and it's something we'll get to a little bit later in the show when we talk about the issue of Black August. But I think it is important we don't overshadow the deep connection really between the state repression against the left. I mean, the whole existence of the FBI is actually a response to, an attempt to, I don't know what you want to call it, tamp down, stop, or whatever, left-wing violence. And then the FBI really comes into its own in the context of the first Little Red Scare after World War I. So it's an important history, and it's a very relevant history to where we are today. But I think to also putting into context, like, who the real enemies of the state are, which I think many people seem to be very confused about.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, we had a few conversations on this show with, Marjorie Taylor Greene talking about defunding the FBI. Marjorie Taylor Greene, if you were watching, I encourage you to go check out. Oh, yeah, that would be actually scary if she was watching our show. She accidentally confused it with like Steve Bannon, like White Power Hour, which is, I guess, an easy thing to confuse. I mean, Steve Bannon, us, do we have a similar look? But no, quite a. But the whole defund the FBI situation, of course, I encourage defunding the FBI, but historically, absolutely been used against the left. So anyways, definitely encourage going to check that out, as well as, we talked about how that relates, most importantly, how that relates to some of the current, I think, struggles inside the left today. I don't mean to be doing a second program about that, but go check it out, you guys. Super important.
Check them all out. Well, if you saw the fantastic documentary that we put out from our time at the People's Summit for Democracy in Los Angeles that we had, I think, a couple weeks ago from Breakthrough News. If you read the credits, you would know that Matt Boleyn, very important member of our team here at Breakthrough, put that whole thing together, and it looked fantastic. And obviously, he's multi-talented. So I'm very excited to announce we've got a new segment for the Freedom Side coming in this week and for all weeks moving forward. State of the Struggle with Matt Boleyn. We'll go to it here.
Hey, what's good, everybody? I'm Matt Boleyn, and you are watching State of the Struggle on Breakthrough News, bringing you the most important headlines in working class struggle from around the world. First up, in South Korea, protesters gathered in central Seoul this Saturday to call on the South Korean government to suspend all joint military exercises with the U.S. They also demanded the dissolution of the South Korean-U.S. alliance and withdrawal of all U.S. forces. In Bangladesh, protesters filled the streets of Dhaka Tuesday to protest the drastic rise in the cost of living and rolling blackouts that have been plaguing the country. The South Asian country shut down all 10 of its diesel power plants after the war in Ukraine drove up the cost of imported fuel. In Haiti, several thousand protesters took to the streets all around the country demanding a better quality of life and the removal of Prime Minister Ariel Henry. This comes just after Haiti's central bank reported that inflation levels have reached a 10-year high in the Caribbean nation. And last week marked 1 year since the full U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, as the country faces a near total economic collapse and widespread famine. In case you're wondering, this was in fact brought on by the U.S. freezing of Afghan currency reserves, sanctions on Taliban leaders, and the loss of billions of dollars in foreign aid. That's it for today, everybody. Now back to the Freedom Side Live with Eugene and Rania.
That was really good.
Yes, right on. That was fantastic. I mean, I wasn't expecting anything less. Obviously, I've been looking over Matt's shoulder, so I knew a little bit about it. But no, it's fantastic. Really appreciate it. Shout out to Matt, who's behind the scenes making many of the things happen that happen on this show and other parts of Breakthrough News. Very excited to have you as a regular part in front of the camera of the Freedom Side moving forward. So State of the Struggle, y'all. Look forward to it every week on the Freedom Side Live, 3 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time.
Yeah, and just a shout out to Matt as well for me. But I still got my eyes on you, Matt. You know what I think about Matt. I think Matt's amazing. I'm worried he's going to take my place on the show.
Well, listen, This is what I like. I like for there to be a healthy competition. No sports team could ever make it if you weren't worried that someone might rise up and take your position. So Rania, if that's how you feel, step your game up. You got nothing to worry about unless you don't think you have the skills.
You won't have gender balance.
I mean, so what do you listen? Don't try to pull me into some separate argument. But no, I do appreciate the segment, and these are all super important stories, and I think it's an important thing for us to have because obviously we talk about a lot on this show, but there's so much more that we can talk about, and so to have an opportunity to really give you guys some of the basic headlines of things that are going on. Really crucial things. I mean, Haiti, which I'm really glad was mentioned there in the segment. It's kind of flown under the radar, but, huge demonstrations that happened there. Interesting context to them. The administration, if you want to call it that, of Ariel Henry basically collapsing. The demonstrations were organized mainly by a group of individuals who actually left the government, and affiliated with various forces. I won't get super deep into it, but some of them close to Venezuela and the Alba countries. But, for almost 3 years now, Haiti has been in an almost constant state of mobilization. Of course, we were there in Haiti last year, and I think you hear quite a bit about all the negative things about Haiti, all of the terrible sort of violence porn elements of it. But I think one of the things that's heavily underplayed is that pretty consistently huge numbers of people for basically nearly 3 years at this point. I mean, a lot of this goes back to 2018, have been constantly mobilizing, doing everything they possibly can. But because of the United States and Canada and the core group countries, they've got their thumb on the scale of the country. And the scary thing is now, I have to say, Rania, is they're growing voices for a new Western-led or potentially Western-led occupation of Haiti.
I mean, that's ultimately what the United States preferred as an outcome, though, right? Like, it almost behooves the United States for Haiti to kind of like devolve into this chaotic situation. It's crazy too that like we still have no real understanding. Like everyone abandoned trying to figure out what really happened and why the leader of the country was like assassinated. And there was like Colombian mercenaries involved, right? I think like attached to like some sort of right-wing paramilitary group. Either way, that was sort of like nobody has ever looked into that any further. It was kind of dropped as a story. We still don't quite know what happened. And now here we are all this time later. And that's really unfortunate because there have been warnings that the U.S. would use the situation in Haiti as an opportunity to justify doing what it loves to do to Haiti, which is occupying
destroy it, occupy it, destroy it. I mean, it's really wild. Yeah, the president of the Dominican Republic is calling for it. You had this letter that came from Luis Almagro, the head of the Organization of American States. I guess this was 3 weeks ago now, maybe 2 weeks ago, where they were sort of tacitly calling for it. The Washington Post has been beating the drum for this really since late last year. So a growing number of voices, but I'm glad you actually raised the issue of how the thing just got dropped in the investigation into the assassination of Jovenel Moise, himself very problematic, but former president killed last July. The whole thing ground to a halt when it came out that the current prime minister, I think he's also technically the current president, so that gives you a sense of how ridiculous this is. It was revealed that the night of the assassination, the people who did the assassination, the assassins, contacted him twice. They called him twice on the phone, and everyone was like, well, why did they call you twice? And he's like, oh, I have no idea. That's funny you would say that. And then the next day, they dismissed the guy investigating it.
It really is incredible. I mean, if a murderer calls somebody like several times.
Twice. What could I mean, it's like, how else could you say that the guy was complicit?
Who's in a position to benefit? The other thing, though, that Matt mentioned was Afghanistan. And I just wanted to note that I think there was like a front page story today about, I think the title was something like how China will choke Taiwan or something like that.
Oh, the New York Times. Yeah. How China will choke Taiwan with the blockade or something.
Right. And I'm just thinking like there's people literally selling their organs to buy food in Afghanistan because the U.S. is choking it, not hypothetically, but like right now, like Joe Biden is refusing to release this like $7 or $9 billion in aid, or not aid, I'm sorry, in central bank assets. Like the U.S. just stole Afghanistan's central bank assets. The country can't buy anything to import. And as a result, people in this country that everybody cared so much about, like last year at this time, it was all we heard about for like a week, because everybody was so horrified that Joe Biden withdrew American troops, and oh my God, the Afghans and the Afghan people, we have to help them. Well, now they're starving. They're literally, babies are starving. There's like famine, man-made famine in this country, actually choking it. And the New York Times has the audacity to post a front page story about how China could hypothetically choke Taiwan.
Right.
Just unbelievable.
It really is unbelievable. And, it speaks to certainly something I know that throughout your entire career, you've put a lot of focus on, Rania, in terms of the issue of sanctions, of like, who are they punishing? I mean, the whole thing is, well, we're going to withhold aid until the Taliban does what we want them to do. And look, I'm not out here to promote the policies of the Taliban, but, I could be wrong, but I mean, it's not the Taliban leaders and ministers, I'm sure, who are suffering from this right now. And I think a lot of the people that allegedly the United States and others claim to be concerned about vis-a-vis this issue of withholding the aid are actually the exact people who are suffering the most from the skyrocketing inflation, the lack of medicine, the lack of food, and so on and so forth. And then on top of that, you have ISIS being resurgent in the country. And everything about it is just so... it's just so absurd because I think you spoke to this. It just goes so against all of the rhetoric around Afghanistan. Although, I don't know. I guess it's outrageous, but I guess not that surprising since we know how fake it was. But no, it's incredibly distressing issue what's happening there, and it seems like it's only going to get worse, unfortunately, because certainly from the Biden administration, there seems to be no movement on actually addressing this. They've already agreed to give half the money away to the families of 9/11 victims, and I'm all for 9/11 victims and their families being taken care of. But so now the average person in Afghanistan has to starve. It just doesn't really. It's unbelievable.
Meanwhile, yesterday we learned that there was a back and forth between the United States. There's like 900 American troops occupying
Syria,
a part of eastern Syria. Basically, its most fertile and oil-rich land. So, like, the U.S. is occupying an area and then denying the Syrian government access to its biggest wheat and oil reserves. And they're actually occupying an area where there's this massive factory that has these big, really expensive condensers that used to feed Damascus electricity and now no longer do. Because again, the Americans have a base there in an area called Conoco. Anyway, the point of raising
let me just ask you this. Is the area is called Conoco or just the base is called Conoco? I was curious about that when I read this morning.
The area is called Conoco. They might have named their base after it because is where it's located. And there also is this big factory with like this really expensive equipment for basically feeding electricity. Distributing electricity. And the point is to say that the United States or the 900 troop station there have been like firing on what they call Iranian-backed militias. What that just means is Iran allied like fighters who fought ISIS. Some of them might be Syrian, some of them might be Iraqi. Probably more Iraqi, but more likely because it's closer to Iraq. But the point is, this is happening with the backdrop, of course, of the nuclear deal talks. And so there was like a back and forth where like the U.S. hit them and then they hit American troops and like lightly injured a couple people. And so then the Americans like bombed some of their vehicles and killed 3 people. And this happened yesterday. And then you had CENTCOM like releasing this press release, basically trying to say they were protecting themselves. What are you doing in Syria? Like, why are there 900 American? We know why, but like, why do you think it's okay for 900 American soldiers to occupy Syria against the will of the government there who want you to leave and to be playing out your war with Iran there? Like, it's just completely outrageous. And it literally was just like it was no big deal in the media except to say that the U.S. was fighting Iran-backed militias. That's how it was reported in the media. And it really angered me because, again, like this mentality, like also happening in parallel to the war in Ukraine, where we're there to protect the Ukrainians. How dare anybody occupy anything? And it's like, how dare Russia take, they're claiming Russia's taking Ukrainian grain, taking Ukrainian oil, all of these things and stealing it. You are literally doing that in Syria, and no one says a word because it's become normal. It is normal to just steal Syria's resources, to deny the entire country access to their own resources, so they're all in the dark and they have food shortages. And then on top of that, to claim anybody who's attacking you in that situation when you're in their country is an act of self-defense on your part. It's just the level of arrogance is really astounding.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a perfect way to put it. I mean, it's so brazen. I mean, it just like, hey, we're just about to just roll into this country. No one asked us to be here, at least no one with any actual technical international law-based authority. And we're just gonna set something up and just start taking oil. I mean, it's really just unbelievable. I mean, it's obviously like a might makes right sort of approach to the world, but it just makes such a mockery of so many things that you, of course, have already laid out, Rania, so I won't repeat them in terms of the double standards. But I agree with you, because it's Syria, it's sort of like, well, who cares? And I mean, in some degree, it reminds me a little bit of you would know better than I, Rania, but a little bit of Lebanon for so many times over the years, where it's like the sovereignty of the country just becomes a subsidiary issue to powerful countries just deciding, well, we're just going to like send some troops over there and just start doing things. And the fact that you can just set up multiple, and I think a lot of people don't even realize this, that there are multiple U.S. bases. I was, laughing when I was reading this story this morning. It was like mission support base whatever. And I'm like, what mission are you supporting? You just self-declared to go in here only to prevent the consolidation, really your own loss, basically, to prevent the consolidation of the victory of Syria and its allies, who, of course, were legally invited vis-a-vis international law to participate in the conflict because you don't like Iran and you don't like Syria, you being the United States. And it really is, people say, oh, it's overblown to talk about imperialism, blah, 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 and people are playing it up too much. But to me, what else can you call it? I mean, it's an outright form of colonial style. I mean, how much different is it from what the British and the French did in the context of the same area that what the U.S. is doing right now in terms of the way it uses its power?
I'll tell you something. Imagine if like 900 Syrian soldiers were stationed near the border of like Canada on the US side, and every time, and they were like, and then they would like
Vancouver or something.
Yeah, and they like bomb Michigan or something, or bomb someone in Michigan, and then the Michigan people hit back, and they're like, "This is self-defense. Like, this is self-defense. We're just protecting ourselves." I mean, it's just completely insane, and it's so. It really angers me because Americans it's so normalized in the minds of so many Americans that it's just okay for us to be everywhere. Like, it's okay for us to be in Syria causing suffering. They deserve it. They don't matter. They're less human. I don't know. Take your pick of whatever. We're civilizing them. Whatever the reason is, it's okay for us to be in Korea. It's okay for us to be in Japan. It's okay for us to be all across Latin America. It's okay for on and on and on and on. And it's tiring. Mm-hmm. It's tiring, you guys. Anyways, Rania's tired.
But it is tiring, but it's important. And I mean, I feel that it's another one of those issues that we were talking about this earlier, it just kind of falls out of the news. And I think Syria is one of those that, at one point it was the sexy issue. And then as soon as the outcome seemed like it wasn't going to be the outcome that the imperial warmongers wanted it to be, miraculously, it just kind of falls out of the news, and these things are just happening. And yeah, I think you're right. I mean, that's why I always say I think that imperialism, I mean, it has many different drawbacks and negative aspects, but it's morally corrosive, I think, for the United States itself. This idea that the United States can and should do whatever it wants, and this idea also that no matter what, the U.S. can do something, right? This whole mentality of like, oh man, this is so terrible, what's going on over there? And it may objectively be terrible, but it's like, well, we got to do something. What can we do? And it always somehow involves the U.S. military. So even just this idea that America is so great and so right and so virtuous that through the use of its power coercively, it can resolve all problems on the global stage is I mean, at best hubristic, certainly arrogant, but it leads to I think it leads to people who even are good-hearted people, most people probably, who want to be doing the right thing, and they see these very curated images for them on the news and the TV with no context, and then it's like, well, we got to do something, and it's almost this rush to do something and this feeling, but it's morally corrosive in terms of the actual impacts it have and the dehumanization of so many peoples around the world in order to carry out these various things. We certainly see it in Africa and other places.
And so much of the time, you actually can do something. You can stop causing the problem.
Right.
Like, you can just stop. You can stop sending weapons. You can stop supporting, like, occupiers. You can stop occupying. Just leave. leave people alone. I know that imperialism can't do that, but it's always just funny to me, the idea of do something. So much of the time, whether we're talking about like Syria or Ethiopia or Eritrea or Cuba or Venezuela, it's like we are the problem. We are doing something, and that's why there's a problem.
Yes.
Anyways.
Well, we are going to turn to a guest we are very happy to have here on a very important topic. Obviously, we're still in the month of August in the United States. That marks Black August, which, among other things, is a month to continue to uplift the political prisoners held in the jails of this country. Yes, the U.S. has a number of political prisoners, continues to hold them in torturous conditions in many cases, I must say. And we are very honored to be joined for this conversation by Dr. Jared Ball, who's a professor of communications at Morgan State University and also the author of the fantastic book, The Myth and Propaganda of Black Buying Power. Jared, thanks so much for being with us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me again.
Well, the pleasure is all ours, and I want to start with a story I actually just saw like 30 minutes ago. I don't know how I missed it, but this issue of the papers of Mumia Abu-Jamal going to Brown University. Now, of course, Mumia Abu-Jamal, one of the longest-held political prisoners in the United States, and there's a couple different elements to it, Jared, but the thing that just struck me the most was the New York Times article about it, which was like Mumia Abu-Jamal was the face of the anti-death penalty struggle in America. Then, it went on to say other things, but this is the headline. And I just thought that the very act of giving the papers, the way this was framed, I mean, you'd think he was dead, but he's very much alive, still in prison in Pennsylvania unjustly. But it's almost like it felt like history was just sort of moving past it. And I mean, certainly I'm curious your thoughts about this very act and certainly the role of the media, but it also does speak to me to the importance of Black August to have a time to lift this up when it's so easy for a major media outlet to just essentially invisibilize a person.
So unfortunately, I always hate when I miss a story in the New York Times, but I did not read that particular one. But if I understand correctly, papers like that often write their obituaries in advance. So maybe this was some sort of leak of the forthcoming obituary that they have planned for him whenever he does pass on. But of course, I'm shocked that they would mention him at all. Much less remind that he is that does exist, that he is, well, from my point of view, and maybe to some others who might remember or be reminded of the fact, unjustly incarcerated and deserving of his freedom. But of the many unpopular, opinions that I have, one of them is that I am not a fan of in the context that we still suffer, of any sort of institutional, even symbolic attempt to praise or give legitimacy to, or some attention to, in this case, in terms of the papers going to Brown, or is the case with Dr. King or Black America writ large, institutionalized and memorialized in museums, which I think are meant more to commemorate a victory over a conquering of, and the collection of trophies for that victory than any sort of actual commemoration, which is how I interpret these things. So given the fact that Mumia is not free, given the fact that Black people are not free, given the fact that the Black August resistance struggle that is born out of political imprisonment is still in need of attention and still being carried on, suggests that the incorporation of Mumia's papers into an elite institution, academic institution, is again sort of more akin to a trophy taking over the victory, over the carcass of a movement. So maybe the New York Times meant that the movement that was meant to free Mumia is weak, if not fully passed on. Maybe that's what they were referencing more than Mumia himself. But that's again something that I think we need to reinvigorate, and in part by remembering what Black August represents and try to commemorate it properly.
Mm-hmm. And Jared, I mean, for those who aren't familiar with Black August, can you maybe give a brief description, understanding of what this means and why it's important?
Sure. So first of all, big shout out to my comrade Kalanji Changa and the FTP movement, who I think are, from my generation, some of the true keepers of the tradition. But as he and others remind us, Black August is not sort of like has been sometimes called the radical Black History Month. Black August is not something to be celebrated. Black August is not even really truthfully meant to be, as it's often become, sort of a celebration of all Black radicalism or all that has taken place in the month of August, but is specific to the struggle of Black political prisoners here in the United States, coming out of the prison movement, coming out of the struggle of George Jackson in particular, the Soledad brothers, people like Katari Golden, and other prisoners who took up that struggle and were either outright killed or left to die intentionally by authorities, denied medical treatment and attention, because they are themselves, that is, those political prisoners, were as I think they put it in their own way, experiencing the imperialism you all were just talking about in its most visceral and abusive and direct form. And out of that contradiction comes maybe the more appropriate analysis that the state is always fearful of, in terms of how people should respond in organization, rebellion, and so on and so forth. So Black August is really meant to be a time to commemorate those Black political prisoners and the political prisoner movement and struggle that they represent. It's meant to be a time of study, of fasting, of sort of refocus and repurposing and recommitment to that struggle for the rest of us who are at least nominally free or freer.
I appreciate that history, and I think it's critically important. And I'm glad you brought that history. I saw some other article, I can't remember where I saw it, in the mainstream media about how Black August is now becoming a quote unquote, I forget exactly what it said, like alternative to Black History Month, which I just thought in and of itself was saying a lot. But yeah, I mean, it does speak, I think, in so many ways, Jared, and I think the point that you made about how Black August is really connected to the issue of ongoing struggle. And I think to link it to the point that you made a little bit earlier about Mumia, I mean, it almost is like, the denial of the fact that there even are political prisoners, the certainly invisibilization of them in, many forms, including, I'm sad to say, even many so-called radical movements in the United States, is all a part and parcel of this attempt, and maybe one of the biggest aspects of our struggle, to sort of close the door on the Black liberation movement, to sort of suggest, not in the most crass way that Obama was elected president, that it's over, but that essentially, the overall positioning of Black people in America has so drastically changed from whatever back then, however we want to classify that the very nature of the struggle is in discontinuity with what individuals were doing, in the Black Panthers, the BLA, other formations that led them to being in prison for fighting for freedom. And that, to me, in and of itself, feels like a very pernicious form of information warfare.
Oh, absolutely. And by the way, we should just step back for a quick second and note the role that, as you put it, information warfare has played in this country, just broadly speaking, in shaping mythologies about capitalism and democracy and U.S. freedom and all that other kind of stuff. It plays and has played a tremendous role. So part of it is the information warfare as it relates to everything, really, but in this case, political prisoners and Black liberation struggles, or the Black liberation movement. But before I forget any more than I already have, I want to sort of respond in the way and pay tribute to, and also shamelessly plug the fact that both will be on with me tomorrow morning. But Jihad Abdul-Mumit, who is in charge or heads up or leads the Jericho movement, and Hiram Rivera were involved in different ways in a conversation the other night hosted by, and shout out to them, Black Men Build, about this very issue. And Jihad, having been a political prisoner and a member of the BLA, had some very strong comments to make that I wanted to pick up from more deeply. And his the point that I'm getting at, that that he brought up last night was that, or the other night, was that the political prisoners that have just recently been released, in particular Russell Maroon Schultz and Sundiata Acoli, and to a certain extent those who are still struggling to free Mutulu Shakur, have been part of the release demanded that they renounce themselves as freedom fighters and accept themselves as having been guilty of a crime. So when you talk about the invisibilization of this struggle, part of the denial of that the U.S. has any political prisoners is in the denial that anyone is politically imprisoned, that they're all imprisoned because they actually did something worthy of imprisonment. And Jihad said even that being in the courtroom when Russell Maroon Schultz, given the name Maroon in part because he kept escaping, that the man was brought to tears at having to stand before a judge and sort of renounce everything he had literally given all of his life and freedom to. And then they're let out just basically in time to die. And in the case of Mutulu Shakur, apparently he himself has not fully renounced, which is why they've left him to die in prison. And what Jihad was saying ultimately, as I interpreted it, was that to really get back to your question, was that this was in part a reflection of the state of that movement, of the struggle, that we are not in a position to make demands for their freedom. We're not in position to free them by other means. We're in position only to have them freed at the will and the whim of the state, and only when they renounce the struggle that put them there in the first place, and the struggle that from my own humble analysis needs to, if not be fully taken up, at least reconsidered and applied in various ways in the struggle that people are engaging in today. So anyway, that I don't know to what extent I fully answered your question, but I did want to at least bring that part up and find a way to not continue to forget to do that, because it was tremendously powerful and something that I think should inspire us all, again, as we commemorate what Black August is actually meant to be.
Mm-hmm. And Jared, I mean, for those who are interested, obviously, in like getting involved in the struggle to free political prisoners, can you give us some names? Because like you mentioned, there is this denial in the United States that we even have a political prisoner problem, of course, because most people are presumed or framed as, oh, they're in prison because they did something wrong. But in fact, of course, we do have many political prisoners. So what are some names, some campaigns people can actually get involved in?
So first, because I'm not going to remember all of them, I would encourage people to be in touch with the Jericho movement, to be in touch with Prison Radio, to be in touch with Black Power Media, humbly, to be in touch with the FTP movement and community movement builders, and people doing the work around political prisoners. But then, of course, there are some of the bigger names that we've mentioned. Mumia Abu Jamal, Leonard Peltier is there. Mutulu Shakur is still imprisoned. Jalil Al-Amin, formerly known as H. Rap Brown, is still imprisoned. There are people who have become political prisoners since being imprisoned for other means, from my generation, for instance, like Kevin Rashid Johnson. So there are a number of folks who are being denied their freedom. Veronza Bowers. I mean, there's so many, unfortunately, still there, even as they continue to age and not do well physically. And so on. So please do check out some of those organizations and outlets that I mentioned already, and find out more of the details of the specific prisoners, write those prisoners. I am fully guilty of not doing enough, despite the work I'm circulating in writing and being in touch with prisoners to the extent that they can be reached. But anyway, so yeah, please follow up with those folks and organizations that I mentioned already.
Mm-hmm. No, critical issue. And just quickly, since you mentioned it, let folks know where they can see the show tomorrow morning, because certainly I think that would be fantastic. I always love to see Jihad, but Black Power Media all the time. But tomorrow morning, it seems like you guys have a show exactly on this.
Yeah. 8 to 10 a.m. tomorrow morning, Black Power Media on YouTube, and at Black Power Media 1, switch the A for the number 1, on Twitter and Facebook, et cetera, and all of that. And yeah, but definitely check out the conversation, whether you can see it live or not. I think it'll be well worth a watch for sure. And again, shout out to Black Men Build for hosting that conversation the other night. That is what's prompting the one we're going to have tomorrow. So.
Right on, definitely. Well, I'll try to share it and get it out. Fantastic work, as always, all across Black Power Media. Jared, as always, really appreciate you giving us some of your time here on the show. Want to shout out The Myth and Propaganda of Black Buying Power, one of my favorite books. But thanks again for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you. Anytime. It's always a pleasure. Shout out to all of you and all the great work that you and your comrades are doing. Peace. Right on. Thank you.
Well, Rania, terrible situation, with so many people that is suffering from so many diseases, being imprisoned, tortured a lot of times in there. I think Jared made a very good point. A number of these people have not been found guilty of anything. They were railroaded, but they basically say if you don't want to die in prison, you have to make these sort of mea culpas as if somehow you did something. It really is disgusting on so many different levels, but an important struggle and a critical issue here in the United States, because really, truly, these are the individuals who fought for a lot of the things that we're about today. But a couple things before we switch gears. Sam Ali, Martin Hernandez, shout out to you for your donations. Really appreciate it. Also want to quickly just shout out an organization Jared mentioned, Community Movement Builders. It has a mutual aid project to support veterans of the Black Panther Party and the Black Liberation Army. Very important initiative.
Yeah, indeed. And I just want to back up what Eugene just said, and also add, we really got to incorporate these names that we just heard into the whole free Julian Assange. Julian Assange is very important, obviously, political as well as an attack on press freedom, but these people are no less worthy of being free for the activism they've been involved in. So we got to expand that struggle from beyond just Julian Assange to include these people as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very, very, very good point, and I appreciate you making it, Rania. We're going to turn here now to South Africa, and we are very honored to be joined here by Sbu Zikhode, who's the founder and president of Abahlali baseMjondolo, the shack dwellers movement in South Africa, which is struggling around many important things and unfortunately is facing a wave of repression. Sbu, thank you so much for being back with us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much, and I am pleased to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Well, we really thank you. I know that this is a tough time for everybody with Abahlali, given that you just lost one of your close comrades to a political assassination. And I was hoping maybe just to start there, tell us about this comrade and what took place that led to him being killed.
Well, I must say that our hearts are heavy. We are really devastated. We have just lost one of the greatest leader our movement has ever produced over the past few years. A young man, he's at least 28 years of age, Lindokuhle Mnguni, who was a chairperson of Abahlali baseMjondolo in a Kenana branch in Durban. Lindokuhle was the cadre that was responsible for providing leadership, but also for building a commune in the Kenana community. So Lindokuhle was gunned down by two unknown men in his home in a Kenana on the morning of the 20th of August. Along with Lindokuhle was his partner, Sindisiwe Ngcobo, who was also shot 3 times. Fortunately, Sindisiwe survived and fought for her life in hospital, but Lindokuhle died on the scene. We are very devastated by this ongoing attack. Lindokuhle is the 4th activist of Abahlali to have been gunned down within the space of 6 months. You will recall that on the 8th of March, Ayanda Ngila, one of the greatest leaders of Abahlali, was also gunned down in a broad daylight in a very same community of Kenana, while the entire community was watching. Women and children were watching in this terror that took place on the 8th of March. Within the same week, on the 11th of March, Siyabonga Manqele in the nearby settlement was also gunned down by what was suspected to have been the police who were raiding in the area. And on the 5th of May this year, a young woman, Noguthula Mabaso, was also gunned down. This is a woman who was also an activist, but also a chairperson of Abahlali. Now, on the 20th of August, at about 1:30 a.m. early in the morning, there comes these two gunmen, whom we believe that these are hitmen who were somehow hired, paid to kill these young leaders. So Lindokuhle Mngunu is a fourth activist to have been assassinated within the space of 6 months. We are really torn apart.
Can you explain obviously we can speculate here, but who do you believe is behind these assassinations? What's the reason? I mean, obviously your movement is involved in getting access to land and housing. So, is this attached to oligarchs? Is it attached to the state? Who's behind this?
Well, the killers are known. Some of them are behind bars as we speak. These are local African National Congress leaders, local leaders. This is the ruling party that was once a liberation movement in South Africa. The same gentleman who's behind the killing is also a faith pastor who has a control over the local police, who also has a vested interest on the occupied land in which the settlement is occupying. So basically, they want to remove the entire community in order to build property so that they can make profit for themselves, because this community is only wanted this land to build houses, decent housing for themselves, but also to engage in the urban farming. They have a community gardens that is so progressive. They have poetry, they run cooperatives, they have a political school named after Frantz Fanon, they have crash. So this is one of the progressive community that really do not want to depend on the state. They are engaged in what we call food sovereignty, in making sure that there's food security for everyone in this community. And this is what they are being killed for.
I think for many people, looking at South Africa, and of course, and remembering the long struggle against apartheid, they see things like this, and I think it makes them wonder, what does that mean about where South Africa is today? What will it take to gain true liberation? Because obviously seeing freedom fighters gunned down shows that there's still so much more left to do.
Well, it means two things. One, it means the liberation movement that was once trusted, that was once an inspiration in this country, is collapsing. And before it collapses, then it wants to blame everyone, that it's losing grounds, it's losing power. But the second thing, it means the end of our constitutional democracy that was hard-won by the people of South Africa, supported by international communities who really help us to bring down apartheid to its knees. It is unfortunately that those who were oppressed before have now become the better oppressors. This is what we are seeing today.
I'm curious, not to pivot too hard here, but I feel like you could probably tie this in because it is the 10th anniversary of the Marikana massacre, which I think it was something like over 30 South African miners were killed by the police during a strike. And I'm curious if you could tie that into some of what you're saying, because there hasn't really been any justice for that.
Yes, I mean, it's just over a week now, South Africa and all of us have been mourning, standing in solidarity with the working class, particularly the miners, who have really at least 34 miners were gunned down by the state-sponsored massacre. Up until today, these miners, widows, children who suddenly became orphans remained without any compensation, or the state is refusing to actually account for these massacres. So it is unfortunately that these people have been killed in the hands of government, who is supposed to be the custodians of our constitutional democracy. So that tells you that South Africa is in trouble. We are now reversing all the gains that were hard won by the people of South Africa. The state that is supposed to be the custodians, the protector of our democracy, is now attacking. Now, the bigger question is, if they kill us, who are they going to govern tomorrow if the governed are being killed by the government? This is the question that we are asking in this government. Like in Abahlali today, police are not taking responsibility. They are not moving swift in protecting the community of Ekenana. I mean, Abahlali has lost at least 24 activists in the past 10 years. So this recent killing on Saturday is the 24th of the activists who have been killed with impunity.
I mean, it's in many ways it's amazing to hear. It's tragic on so many different levels, but it just, in some ways, the fact that you all are being targeted so heavily, I think, does speak to the vitality of your work and what you're able to do and the number of masses you're able to unite. So, I mean, if you could talk a little bit more about the work of Abahlali and the work that you're doing and the struggles that you're waging.
Yes, I must say that we are inspired. In fact, we have deep love for humanity. You will recall that the agenda of Abahlali is very clear. We want to build an equal and a just society based on respect and dignity for all humankind. Since our focus is on urban areas, urban slums, what we call shack settlement, it is our daily struggle that everyone has a decent housing. In order for us to have this decent housing, we really have to occupy vacant and unused land, because the land in South Africa remains in the hands of the minority white commercial farmers. So the Black South Africans only received political freedom in 1994. Economically, we are still poor and we live in deep poverty. So South Africa is known to be one of the most, if not the first, inequality, one of the most unequal society in the world. So our work basically is to democratize settlements of Abahlali, is to organize the working class and the impoverished, is to educate our communities around the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa and international laws. But most importantly, what we do, we try to humanize the world. We want to build an inclusive economy, a world that embraces every human being. So this is what we want to see, so that everyone is happy, everyone can enjoy life, equal opportunities are really given to every human being, not just South Africans or the region. We also believe in the international solidarity. We think global communities need to reject any form of violence, anywhere, everywhere, at any time.
And where can people follow what's happening with your organization? What's happening in South Africa in general? What are some maybe media outlets or websites that people can look to for information about that? Because oftentimes, this stuff isn't really being covered by the mainstream media, by the international media.
Well, Abahlali has a very beautiful website, a colorful Facebook page. It's www.abahlali.org. So we can actually be reached there, or +27 31 304 6420. We want to make a plea and we want to make an international call that our friends, our partners, our comrades, and those who are progressive, who love Democrats and humanity, we call on for international solidarity, that we are under attack here. And of course, we do not know who's the next. So the slogan that is with Abahlali in this week, am I the next? So there's so much of violence in this country, gender-based violence, violence against the minority, violence against the LGBTIQ plus communities, violence against women and children. We are saying enough is enough.
Well, Sabu, we really appreciate you. I know it's late over there, but giving you some of your time here on the freedom side, helping to inform us all, and I hope everybody goes and shows their solidarity with Abahlali. But thank you again, Sabu Zakoti, the founder and president of the Shack Dwellers movement in South Africa.
Thank you, everyone.
Ooh, that's
Powerful
a lot to be up
movement,
against.
Terrible
Indeed,
situation.
indeed.
100,000 people organized by the Shack Dwellers movement in South Africa. And yeah, I mean, they're being targeted because they're effective. I mean, that's the sad thing, is that, you know, they're effective in trying to help people reclaim land, build new communities, reclaim their dignity, have basic services, food sovereignty. And this is the result. It's a terrible, terrible, terrible situation.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, can you imagine 100,000 people organizing 100,000 people in the U.S. for a cause like that? That's a lot. That is like, imagine the, you know, the sort of repression that would provoke from ruling elites. That's scary if you're the ruling class, to have 100,000 people organizing to try to get equal access to land and housing.
Yeah,
and more than that.
No, for sure. I mean, the reality is, you know, since the very beginning, I mean, this is why the U.S. supported apartheid in South Africa, and it's why they've gone to such great lengths in the post-apartheid era to consolidate and promote the, you know, most regressive reactionary forces in South Africa, specifically because, you know, the type of spirit and the type of ideology that Abahlali is bringing to the table, which is the true spirit of the liberation movement, you know, is dangerous to global imperialism, certainly to their agents in South Africa, to have a potentially, you know, such a powerful country like South Africa potentially, you know, moving in a direction that is, you know, more liberatory, more emancipatory. And these things aren't, you know, there aren't accidents. Like, it's not random that these things are happening, and it's not random that, as you said, you don't hear that much about it, and it's certainly not that random that, you know, certain individuals in positions of authority, if not power, are acting in such a way towards a liberatory movement. So I think it's an important wake-up call about the realities of quote-unquote development all across the global South, that it's not just a blank page, and it's not just, you know, a handful of corrupt people here and there, although that's a factor, but it really is the broader systemic reality that this kind of corruption, these kind of misleaders, this is all being cultivated, you know, in Washington and Brussels. Some people might say it's conspiratorial, but, you know, all you got to do is look at the huge number of programs, all these, you know, CIA adjacent type programs, NED, all of that have in DC and places like that, bringing people from Africa, training them. I saw something the other day, you know, at the U.S. Embassy in some country, I can't remember where. It wasn't Ethiopia, it was somewhere else. Anyway, it was like a media training. And it was like, we're training, maybe it was Uganda, I don't know. But it was like, we're training these young Africans on how to be, you know, critical media people or whatever, as if the U.S. has a critical media.
You want to know, you just reminded me, not to like take away from what you're saying, but there was actually, you know, the American University of Beirut in Lebanon. It's the American University of Beirut because it's an American university,
Right.
but it's also Lebanon. And there was like this media training they were doing, and somebody from El Manar attended. And El Manar, you might remember, is like the affiliated with Hezbollah, which the U.S. considers terrorists and sanctions. And once it got back to like whoever at Langley that oversees whatever happens at the American University of Beirut, I'm assuming that's probably how it went down. No, actually it was somebody at the State Department, got back to them that somebody, like some journalist from Manar, had attended this, I think it was actually maybe some pro-Israel group that made a scandal out of this. The U.S. State Department sued the American University of Beirut for teaching media training to terrorists. And and what's crazy, because AUB, which is again funded by America, had to lost obviously, and had to pay money to the American State Department.
It's amazing. Just one person into a conference.
One person into it was like a class. It was a media training class.
Jesus.
Yeah. At a university. It was kind of an incredible story, because I'm like, so you're suing yourself? Like, you're suing yourself for your own money. It made no sense to me. But but to speak to all the nefarious activities that go on, and how actually, to me, that spoke to how actually involved the Americans are at AUB, to the point where the State Department gets back to the State Department that one person from a media outlet they don't like attended this media training. So it just speaks to
Well,
you
good
know.
friend of BT, Ajit Singh, actually has a piece about this related to South Africa in Monthly Review
Mhm.
online. I don't know, it's 3-4 weeks ago now. People can look it up. But speaking exactly to what you're saying, Rania, is these networks that exist around these media trainings and this, that, and the third. Very interesting piece.
But of course, interestingly enough, when it comes to Africa, it's like all about revving up hatred for China.
Yeah, and Russia, where
Yeah.
they now are doing everything to try to. They have a bill in Congress to counter "quote unquote" Russian influence in Africa, and there's an unbelievable article. Maybe I'll use this to segue into our next conversation here. In the New York Times of a woman who's a legislator in Guinea-Bissau and how she's supporting Russia versus Ukraine. Go read the article. I mean, in some ways, it's kind of like softly mocking her. That's how I read it. But nevertheless, this boogeyman in fear of Americans that like, oh my God, somehow Africans are seeing through the propaganda around Russia and Ukraine. I mean, no surprise there. But nevertheless, it's an interesting element of what's happening on the African continent, this moving of Russiagate type propaganda, if you will, into Africa.
No, indeed. But speaking, I mean, I think that's a good segue
Yeah.
into what we were going to discuss next, which is speaking of Russia.
Yes, the assassination,
Hey!
sort of
Yeah.
shock assassination, of Darya Dugina, who is the daughter of Aleksandr Dugin, who's a known thinker there in Russia and around the world to some degree, but nevertheless, his daughter was assassinated while driving her car, leaving a conference. It seems to have been a pretty brutal assassination by all counts. The Russian government, of course, they've actually already released a photo of the person, the suspect, and their narrative of what took place. What the Russians are saying is that it was the Ukrainian government launching an operation the parts that's unclear is, were they trying to assassinate Darya Dugina or were they trying to assassinate her father, Aleksandr Dugin? But nevertheless, that the Ukrainian government was behind it. They've released some photos of the person in various parts of Russia. And Ukraine, of course, is denying this. So, since we're talking about lawsuits, just putting that on the record. But nevertheless, I have to say, Rania, when you put it in the context of what took place in the days leading up to it, it certainly lends credence from my point of view to, Ukraine being behind it.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it also speaks to a sort of like new we've reached a new point in this war where this is a car bomb, right? This is like, First of all, I think it speaks to a certain level of weakness for the Ukrainians. I don't think they're doing very well in this war. Car bombs are typically kind of weapon of the week. Ukraine is not like exactly winning. I don't think anyone's winning, really, if we want to talk about winning, but Ukraine certainly is losing very badly, I think, as well. Like they're losing 5 to 1,000 people a day from their own accounts. Ukrainian officials are the ones who've said that. They're losing more territory. It's kind of clear that ultimately what the outcome of this is going to be, and you can talk more about that, is going to be some sort of resolution when everybody decides that they're done, fueling a proxy war. There's going to be some sort of resolution of, okay, Ukraine won't join NATO, and certain parts of the country are just going to become part of Russia. That seems to be where it's heading. The point is, Ukraine is in a very weak position right now. And what people do when they're in a weak position is they plant car bombs, they plant IEDs, they kind of turn to these guerrilla warfare tactics. And so I do think it speaks to a certain weakness among the Ukrainians, as well as, at the same time, like, what does it mean when we talk about the way the mainstream media has covered it? They've tried to sort of justify this in many ways. It's almost been like a celebratory situation. Whatever you want to say about Aleksandr Dugin, they've tried to almost justify it. They call him Putin's brain. They've even stated, some outlets have stated that he's the mastermind behind the entire invasion of Ukraine. Obviously, he's not maybe necessarily a marginal figure in Russia, but I certainly haven't really seen evidence that he's Putin's brain or that he's the one masterminding the entire invasion of Ukraine. So it's interesting that they chose him as the figure to, or if it was the Ukrainians, I should say, that they chose him as the figure to do this to. But there's a lot to say about this. I think I'm curious first, before we kind of get into the broader picture stuff here, what do you think it means for like the ground war that's taking place?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, when you put it into context, I mean, just a few days before this takes place, the killing of Darya Dugina, you have, and people will probably remember this because each one was celebrated when it happened, and I think that's what's important. You had the bombing of several bridges, very important bridges in the southern part of Ukraine that's occupied by Russia. So when that happened, it was like Ukraine strikes these bridges and, makes a big blow against the ability of Russia to move its forces around, so on and so forth. It's all, in connection with this seemingly non-existent but constantly talked about offensive in southern Ukraine that's going on. Then a couple days after that, you have, at least what the Russians have said, was a drone attack on the headquarters of the naval forces of the Black Sea in Crimea, also carried out by Ukraine. And so, another attack behind quote unquote enemy lines, if you will, from the Ukrainians. And then you have this assassination of Darya Dugina happening a few days after that. And then a few days after she's killed, you have the next announcement of a huge tranche of weapons coming from the United States and to a lesser extent, the United Kingdom. And I think it speaks very much to the point you were making, Rania, in terms of what the impact of these sorts of things are. Because from my point of view, it seems relatively clear at this stage in the game, and it's not just me saying this now. I mean, even Anthony Blinken, in announcing some of these recent weapons shipments, was saying, well, this is to help them at the negotiating table. So not to win the war. And I think just about everyone looking at it figures that whatever the different modalities of this will be, that some element of this is probably going to be Ukraine ceding some territory in the east, or at least some sort of highly autonomous reality for areas in the east, and some form of neutrality vis-a-vis the issue of NATO. But of course, the United States, NATO itself, elements within Ukraine, they want to keep the war going because they want to be able to, in their own words early in the conflict, weaken Russia. They're willing to fight to the last Ukrainian, all these things that I think have become relatively clear. But as it becomes relatively clear that Ukraine probably isn't going to win, how do you continue to build support for these massive shipments, tens of billions of dollars of weapons, and the satellite assistance that they're giving them, and all these different things that are happening? Well, you have to make it seem like you still got a shot. And these sort of spectacular behind enemy lines kind of attacks, from my point of view, lend credence to that. Because then you can say, well, listen, they're still in the fight. They're still in the game. We give them a few more weapons. They're going to be able to push this way, push that this way. They're going to get the upper hand in negotiating with Russia, this, that, and the third. And so to me, I put this assassination very much in the context of these other two events in the days leading up to it, because you have three major quote unquote behind enemy lines sort of attacks, all of them on, I would say, at least sort of symbolically important things, right? Like bridges vis-a-vis Russia's ability to move its troops around in a key theater, the headquarters of the Russian Navy in Crimea, which is has its own history, of course, with this conflict, but also the importance of the Black Sea Fleet. And then someone who is the daughter of someone who's identified, as you said, very heavily in the international mind of being, very close to the Kremlin. So like the only way this is really going to play out in terms of an assassination like this is to draw sort of more like, oh, they hit right at the heart of sort of the Russian leadership and the Russian intelligentsia. And so why would you do all these things in such close proximity to one another, and then a few days after that you get this next shipment of weapons, unless you're really trying to shape the environment of how people are seeing the contours of the war to help make sure that in Europe, Western Europe, which is suffering in and of itself economically, and in the United States, that these people who want to keep shipping these weapons and keep the war going, that you can continue to build a consensus among people to support that.
Yeah, and it is interesting. I think those are all excellent points. You're absolutely right. And it is interesting, by the way, I just want to note that, a week before, I think there was the attempted killing of Salman Rushdie, and the entire, Western media was horrified. I mean, it is horrifying whenever anybody is attacked because they wrote a book that people didn't like. I do encourage people to go check out my interview with Ali Abunimah, specifically the part where we talk about Salman Rushdie, because I think he had some really interesting things to say about that. But the same international media that was like horrified by that was, again, kind of celebrating this because, Aleksandr Dugin is seen as this like really reprehensible figure, and arguments have been made that he does have reprehensible views. I don't think we need to like get into deciding whether he has reprehensible. Well, maybe we do a little bit, but because I know there's been a bit of a debate online about whether it's right to attack his views when his daughter was just killed, which is horrible that his daughter was just killed. It's horrible. Nobody deserves that. It shouldn't happen to anybody. However, I think that there is this other aspect of this that I know you have a lot of interesting things to say about, which is Aleksandr Dugin did write this book about multipolarity. Many people were raising that. We've talked a lot about multipolarity on this show, on Breakthrough. A lot of our guests have had very interesting things to say about that, from, Vijay Prashad to Brian Becker to even you, Eugene, as well, because we are entering this multipolar world where America is still in charge, but it's certainly not as in charge as it was before. It's, weakened a bit. You have the rise of China, especially. You have Russia confronting America in a very aggressive way in Ukraine through this proxy war. So that, all of that in mind, I'm curious if you can maybe tie together something that we can maybe learn from some of the things that Aleksandr Dugin says about multipolarity and what that means for, there's a lot of people who believe that just the mere existence of a multipolar world means something very good, especially for those of us on the left, just by, the world no longer being unipolar.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I mean, I think one way to look at the context of multipolarity, right, is it heightens the contradictions, to pull an old Marxist term out of the bag there. Also, by the way, shout out to Tafari for your donation there. We see that.
Thank you, Tafari.
But, it heightens the contradictions on the world level. I mean, I think as you mentioned, this is perhaps not the time or the place to get into the whole history of Aleksandr Dugin, but, when you look at sort of I would say sort of eclectic synergy that he brings together in his ideas, which is, very wide-ranging, and, it's sort of a interesting combination of, pro-czarist Russian imperialism, Stalinist nostalgia, the use of fascist imagery openly, I think, in some cases, and, tying to people like Julius Evola, all in kind of sort of one worldview that more than anything else, I think, speaks to the idea of Russia not continuing to be subordinated to the sort of Western hegemonic outlook. And I think when you look at multipolarity, and when I say heightens the contradictions, that's kind of the reality behind it, right? Is that there are a range of different people with a range of different views that, whatever else you can say about them, are broadly united in the sense that their views put them into opposition with the sort of Euro-Atlantic, NATO, US, EU, UK imperialist agenda, right? And so, you have everyone from Dugin to the Iranian leadership to the socialist movements that are sweeping across Latin America to, whatever. We could go on and on in terms of who the various forces are. Countries from Cuba to Iran to Eritrea, individual movements in these different countries, many of which sometimes they have things in common. Obviously, Cuba, Venezuela, Eritrea, countries like that have more in common with others. But in many ways, there's a lot of eclectic differences between all these realities, because unipolar U.S. imperialism's main goal is to keep its own power and to bring down anybody who is pushing against that agenda. And so in the context of multipolarity, I think it recognizes a couple different things. One, that this is opening up a lot of potential leverage points for countries around the world to develop themselves. But two, multipolarity is not actually enough. And just because individuals are against Western hegemony doesn't mean that they have good, positive, progressive ideas for how, certainly our country, their country, or others should necessarily be run. And really the challenge of multipolarity is how to create a different agenda. And I think you mentioned Vijay Prashad, who talks about this a lot, how to create a different agenda for humanity. So not just what we're against, but what we're for. And, obviously there's an element of transitional realities there where all these things are in flux and in change. And that's what struggle is really about. But I think, going back to our last guest, Sabu Zicote from South Africa and the Shack Dwellers movement, and the image they're putting forward of a people-centered rather than a profit-centered world, which is what we're also seeing in the powerful social movements in Latin America. It's certainly some of the challenge being posed by the socialist countries in Asia towards sort of the Western model and so on and so forth in terms of how the world should be shaped. And I think that's the real challenge of the moment for multipolarity for people who aren't just saying we're against imperialism, but we want to see a different, more just, more sustainable, fairer world, is how to create a pole within the multipolarity that speaks to a new world order that, can help human beings as a species live sustainably between ourselves and sustainably with the planet. So I think that it opens up a lot of these conversations to talk about these differences between different forces that find themselves in contradiction to U.S. imperialism, comparing and contrasting and determining, what's good, what's bad. I mean, I hate to use those black and white terms, but then to sort of situate ourselves in that landscape and wage our own struggle for what the future of the world should look like. And I think that's a lot of what we've been trying to stress in these conversations around the Ukraine conflict, which obviously, and this was a big point of Putin's speech recently, exactly to this point at the St. Petersburg, I think it was the St. Petersburg International Security Conference or whatever. Well, we've now entered this new era of multipolarity. The unipolar era is over. Well, if we accept that transition is happening, okay, what does that mean in terms of the current moment and what does it mean on how we go forward?
Right. What replaces it? So in that sense, like multipolarity can be a tool.
Yes.
To a better world, but alone multipolarity doesn't necessarily mean a better world.
I think that's a great way to put it. I mean, obviously, you look at what's happening around the globe, and it's obvious that there's sort of an arbitrage element to it, where because of the contradictions between the U.S. and Europe and Russia and China, there are countries who can sort of leverage that and get more out of it and to some degree step their game up in terms of their ability to develop. But even that is deeply limited because we can see Venezuela, I think, is a very good example of this, right? I mean, a country that has a very sophisticated, robust, fair, neutral diplomatic stance. They have good relations with just about every other country but the United States, the United Kingdom, and the EU. And they've gained a lot from it, but still, because of the existence of U.S. imperialism, the ridiculousness of the United Kingdom and, continuing to recognize this clown Juan Guaido, they're still deeply limited in what they're able to gain from these relationships because there's so much pressure being put on so many different countries to try to destroy and to strangle Venezuela and allow them from growing. So until you think about how do we move just beyond, leveraging this or that thing in a less than ideal situation to how do we change the overall relationship of forces in the country so a country like Venezuela can thrive instead of having to scrape and scrimp and find every little, crack in the system to survive, we're limiting sort of the horizon of where we're looking.
Also, it could be said too, I mean, I don't know how much this relates, but like during the Cold War, you could imagine if there was some big socialist or communist country that was offering people like free healthcare and free education, we might be able to argue in America. It might even give us leverage here in America to argue for more than $10,000 in student debt relief.
Well, I think that's true. One of my favorite books about that exact issue is a book called Cold War Civil Rights, which lays out very clearly, and there are many other books who lay this out. Taylor Branch's trilogy about the civil rights movement also lays this out pretty clearly, that, a huge impetus of why the civil rights movement happened the way it did, a huge part of the so-called, post-war, the social contract, as it were, Treaty of Detroit and, good factory jobs and all of that was directly related to the fact that the United States needed to counter the Soviet Union. And that's definitely also true about the so-called welfare state in Western Europe. And I think, quite frankly, this is why these things immediately started to go away when the Soviet Union was gone, because it was directly set up against it. But whatever else you can say about the Soviet Union, when you have a society that says, first and foremost, we're going to use our resources to house everyone, to feed everyone, to provide healthcare for everyone, to provide education to everyone, and to do it in a multilingual, multinational kind of way, to attack racism and national oppression in a serious way, then it makes the so-called Western democracies that claim to be free think, well, if we're going to counter that, well, we can't have Jim Crow, we can't have, people starving, this, that, and the third. And so they rearranged the societies to try to wage a propaganda war. And then the first chance they got, they reversed the whole thing. And, Rania, I mean, you just have to walk around the streets here in Washington, D.C., New York City, San Francisco. You can see how amidst great wealth, this country just could care less about, so many poor and working class people.
I mean, even middle class people, like it's arguable that they're that middle class people, like are you really middle class if yes, you have this like salary that looks really big, if you compare it to like 1990 and what in 1990 you thought would be a big salary, but you're in debt. Like everything's debt. You're living paycheck to paycheck. Like, sure, are you comfortable? Maybe you're like, yeah, you have a house over your head. But like all of these stresses of owing like tens of $1,000s here and hundreds of thousands of dollars there are weighing on you all the time. And if you lose your job overnight, you'll like be literally be homeless. That's kind of the state of the middle class in America right now. And like maybe you have some retirement savings, maybe you don't. Like it really is arguable. What it depends on what your definition of middle class really is.
Listen, most people, I think a lot of people would say, oh, you're making like $120,000, $150,000, you're making a lot of money, which in many cases you are. But the reality is, I think to speak to your point, most people making that kind of money really are living paycheck to paycheck. The average American couldn't find $400 in an emergency. I know very, very few people who, if they just lost their job and had no income for 4 months, would be able to maintain their lifestyle. They'd be out on the street, And so it's a very, even quote unquote, middle class realities in America are so precarious because of how difficult it is to live and to survive, and how much everything is based on, essentially chance to a large degree in people's ability to get what they need. But I think that's a good segue about people coming together collectively to improve their circumstances. And I think we certainly here have been talking about it at Breakthrough News. Many people around the world, I would say, have been deeply captivated by this. What I'm talking about is the wave of organizing across Starbucks stores in every corner of the United States. And we are very honored to be joined by one of these workers who is banding together with their colleagues to unionize, Veronica Gonzalez, who's a Starbucks employee at a store in LA, I think Cypress and Figueroa, that did just recently unionize. Veronica, thank you so much for being with us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate having a platform to talk about all of this. I feel like, it's not getting enough coverage. I feel like within platforms like these, you guys are probably hearing about it a little too much. I feel like on our side, we're not hearing about it enough.
Well, I'll tell you, I can never hear too much about it because I'm deeply inspired by what you all are doing and just store by store, winning. But, talk about the conditions at your store and what really led you all to come together to take this step to form a union.
Yeah. So it really does link in with, the struggles we're having day to day, right? I'm seeing our partners coming into work, not being able to pay their bills. What I personally feel was one of the biggest union busting tactic they dished out at us was a labor cut, national labor cut. They did it to all stores. So regardless of their record-breaking winnings throughout the pandemic, they still decided to cut all stores' labor almost in half. So my store makes roughly $90,000 a week. It's the fastest store in the district. It makes the most money in the district. And yet all of our partners were cut from 30 hours to 20. I feel like people don't understand. A lot of people don't understand. People work these jobs that look just like you. They're of all age ranges, all races, all ethnic backgrounds. Like, we're all at Starbucks. I don't think they understand how many of us are actually employed by the siren, So, seeing all these people that I work with day to day, basically, take this cut and have to struggle with it. And the way we struggle, and try to get through it by picking up more hours, trying to pick up shifts from others. Like, when you're struggling for money, you don't really have any leeway. And it kind of led to the, idea that why are we struggling? We make this company so much money. And specifically for me, my store is located within my community. I've lived in Cypress Park my whole life, and it's kind of just like I watched this company just take from the community and not pour back in, right? Like, Starbucks can say, "Oh yeah, we donate all these travelers," but what about your workers? You're not paying us a living wage. We're in California. We're in Los Angeles. Like, 16 an hour, what does that get you? That's barely getting you your latte and panini when you go to Starbucks. So it's kind of ridiculous. Like, you're building all this wealth and not pouring back into our cups at all, and we're struggling. I mean, hearing you guys talk about how people are struggling on $150,000 salary, people at Starbucks who are like really dedicated to the company have been there. There are people that have worked for Starbucks that have been there 20 years. You know, they're not making 100,000. I can guarantee you that. There are people that are staying in these roles because, you know, it's somewhere. Starbucks used to paint itself as a company that wanted to keep you there. It had pensions, and then it started becoming like, I feel like the mask came off. I don't think it was ever like something so grand, such an amazing company. Obviously, something as big, a coffee chain wants money, but I feel like its mask really fell off throughout the pandemic, and it's just nasty. I feel like we're working at McDonald's, and fast food workers deserve more. I feel like that's one of the things that people don't understand. Like Starbucks is becoming no better than that, and they know that, and they're working towards pushing their workers out with these labor cuts. Because who's going to work at Starbucks when you only have 20 hours? The people that I work with daily, you know, my partners have kids. So we call them partners, right? They call us partners. They don't treat us as partners, but we're considered partners. And it's just, you know, I'm watching them struggle. I don't think it's crazy to say they're struggling. They picked up second jobs. Like, that's not okay. One job should be enough. And it's just upsetting to be in this state. It feels so, I mean, it feels very surreal, but I mean, it is the reality of it. Like, yeah, no, one job should be enough. That's not radical. Like,
No.
I get it. And some people want to demean the working, like the food workers, working class, whatever you want to call it. Like, we're still people at the end of the day. We still have to survive. Like, we still have to eat. And you still have to pay rent. You still have to find somewhere to live and pay that off too. Like, I don't know why it's like, oh, you work at Starbucks. Like, this corporation makes billions of dollars. This store is making triple what they're paying us daily. And, you know, it just doesn't make any sense. Like, I think it's just all of these questions being posed and the answers not being good enough. I think that's what really motivated us to strive for change, right? It just sucks because one of the struggles we're having is, you know, we organized, right? We're not being heard. We're not being heard. And that's why you're seeing strikes all over. It's not because, oh my God, like this is all it is. They unionize, they strike. No, we have to. We're not being listened to. Howard Schultz is not coming to the bargaining table. And that's one of the biggest issues we're having right now, right? Unions are good when it comes to large corporate in any environment, right? In order to like be heard as a collective. But it's not being shown through this. Stores are unionizing, still not being acknowledged by Howard Schultz, and then we're being forced to strike. And it's being turned into like this, like the workers against the company. And it's like, no, these workers don't want to strike. They just want to go to work and be like taken care of. I think that's just the reason why all these stores are, you know, motivated to organize, you know, motivated to strike, just motivated in general. It's just sad.
So you all were able to actually unionize, which is really great. What does that mean for you? Like, what can you do with that? And also, can you talk a little bit about, because we've seen some Starbucks, I guess, Starbucks chains around the country attempt to unionize and then all get fired. So obviously there's definitely a pushback to prevent unionizing. So also, what were some of the challenges you faced while trying to accomplish that?
Yeah. So one of the biggest things is labor cuts and labor cuts. So the union busting, they're sitting people down and they're having these conversations about how they're going to lose their benefits, which benefits entail healthcare, childcare, their hours slashed. And then, you know, in the extreme cases, although it's illegal, losing their job, right? So they really pumped through fear through all these stores. And I think, yeah, that's one of the biggest things that we face. Like, they really turned up the union busting tactics and I guess had their fingers crossed that we were like, you know, dumb enough to not question it. I don't think I'm being crazy by saying they think we're dumb.
No, I think that is the case. I mean, it's certainly, you just look at the statements that they're making in and of themselves, the threats that they're making towards people, as you put, they're firing huge numbers of people. And I know now this has been a big story this week about all the forms of retaliation that are out there. I guess, in some ways, one thing I'm curious about, Veronica, is, through this experience, do you feel all of the pushback from Starbucks is demoralizing people, or do you feel like it's energizing people? Because as much as I keep seeing all of this terrible stories of the attacks they're doing against workers, I do just keep seeing stories of this store is unionizing, that store is unionizing, just coming, one after the other. So it seems like despite the fact that they're pushing back so hard, it isn't crushing the spirit of workers.
Most definitely. And it's definitely energizing because it just goes to show, right? If they don't care, then who's going to care? I think like the turning point is now, like we've passed it, but I feel like everyone's just starting to really realize, wow, as I said, the mask's falling off. And now it's just like, okay, so this is what you think. And, we know, I think one of the biggest things that I said, we have to create that value within ourselves. You're not showing it to us. You're obviously trying to pull us out. So us collecting and giving it our best isn't going to kill us. You've already put us through hell through the pandemic. This isn't anything. They waged this war and it shouldn't be a war. Just pay us right. Pay us right. Give us better working conditions. I don't think people understand how stressful it is to work at Starbucks. It's oh, it's just pouring coffee. No, drive-throughs and, with the uproar and customization and drinks and the labor cuts, etc. I think the labor cuts is what makes it so stressful. And they have these things called customer connection scores, which they basically rate our store on, and then they cut labor based off of that. And it's kind of just they're setting us up for failure and then want to point to it and be like, well, this is why we're doing this. And it's no, you're setting us up to fail. And then it's just, oh my God. It's ridiculous. Working at Starbucks is stressful, as many people would think, oh, no, you're just pouring coffee. I wish it were just that. If it were just that, this movement wouldn't exist.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, no, I agree with you 100%. I mean, anytime I go into Starbucks early in the morning, I mean, it just seems insane. I mean, just the volume of things happening all at once is just unbelievable. The fact that you all make it all work. I mean, to me, that in some ways is the most deeply impressive thing. Sorry to cut you off there, Rania, but I mean, it really is, just criminal to hear that they're laying off large numbers of people, knowing, how difficult it is. But sorry, Rania, go ahead.
No. I was actually just agreeing with you. I'm just thinking of the Starbucks around the area of Manhattan where you are, Eugene, and going there in the morning and actually being really stunned because you're dealing with the online orders. You're dealing with an insane line of people asking for, like you mentioned, these customized drinks. Everybody has super specific things that they want. You've got one or two people making the drinks. It's just, there's a lot going on. And it's actually kind of you got to have some magic to make that work. There's nothing, I've never once walked into a Starbucks and thought to myself, these people are just pouring coffee. That's for sure.
And I really appreciate that. Yeah, no, I would say a good amount of our customers, we serve the people, we serve the community that we are located in. We see all kinds of people, and especially with the store that grosses that much, and is making 90,000 a week. We see all types of people, and it's just very interesting. I feel like one of the biggest things with the company is that we're demanding for is respect. You guys are acknowledging things that I wish a third of our customers acknowledged. We get yelled at by management. We get yelled at by, as I said, the scores, why do they look like this? And it's kind of just well, we're not staffed properly. We don't have enough. And people love to point out, there's a bunch of people there. At the end of the day, for a store that busy, it's still not enough. It's still not enough because you are dealing with mobile orders. So cafes have that stream of income, which is you walking in, and then they have mobile orders, right? So that's technically two stores in one. And then if you're walking into a drive-through, they have mobile orders, a cafe, and a drive-through. So that's three And then that's not taking into consideration Uber Eats. So they're making like a bunch of money off of these things. So I guess a cafe has 3 streams of income. They have Uber Eats, they have the mobile orders, and then they have the cafe. And then you have a drive-through, which has if it has a cafe, or walk up. Some of them are walk up now. You're gonna walk up, so you have the cafe, you have the drive-through, you have the Uber Eats, and then you have the mobiles. It's a lot of things going on, as you said, and it's just like they're not staffing us properly. When it comes to complaints, like, we get the brunt of it, right? So we're there, we're serving the people, we're making the drinks, and we get the brunt of it. Like, I wish it were all like a cakewalk and everyone was super nice, but we're not. I feel like that's one of the biggest things, like, across everywhere. I haven't had my coffee. We deal with that. That's not an issue, but like on the company side, like, you can't be upset when you're not staffing us, and then we're getting customers who, you know, just want to get in and out, and they can't get in and out because we're not staffed. It's kind of, as I said, set up for failure.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. Well, before we let you go, let me just ask you this. I think amongst the many people who are seeing it and are inspired, what can people do to support these efforts to unionize Starbucks nationwide?
I think the biggest thing is having conversations. So based on your audience, there is no way someone listening doesn't know someone that works at Starbucks or frequents a Starbucks. Everyone, and there's no issue, right? We have a contract. It's the pledge. To take the pledge, it's the no contract, no coffee, and it's basically we're trying to get people to sign just so the pledge is just so you don't have to stop buying Starbucks. We know you're gonna buy Starbucks, and buying Starbucks is what earns us our labor. At the end of the day, if there's no people, there's no job. So we sadly understand that, and so it's just taking the pledge, if and when the time comes, just to, like, we're having sip-ins to show support, which I personally think if it's at a drive-through, don't do. But I think one of the things you can do is spark those conversations. Sorry, I had someone. Spark those conversations with the people you do know, right? Just because you don't know a store's where a store is, right? So, like, let's say you walk in and there's a manager and they pick that up. Yeah, there's a bunch of union busting going on in the store already, but we don't want them feeling like it's already happening in a store that it's not happening in. And then, you set off an alarm that shouldn't have been set off. So I would suggest, considering you have such a big audience, just having those people talk to the people that they know that work at Starbucks. Maybe they're regulars. Start talking to their regular baristas. I mean, as I said, customer connection is a thing. So your baristas, if you frequent a Starbucks, there is a barista that knows you. So
that's 100% true. That's 100% true. No, I appreciate that. And I appreciate everything you guys are doing in LA and around the country. Veronica, is really an honor to have you here on the show. Veronica Gonzalez, Starbucks worker, organizing with the broad nationwide campaign to unionize Starbucks. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much.
Well, best of luck to them. She was great.
Fantastic.
Really good job conveying like the stress and frustration, but also like excitement behind the sort of collective action that we're seeing around this issue across the country.
Yeah, I think that they're winning something like 80% of elections they're filing, which is very good.
That's
and obviously there's thousands of Starbucks in the country, so there's a long way to go, but I think this has been super inspirational. And yeah, sign that pledge. I mean, and if people make the call, do what we have to do. This guy Howard Schultz, he's unbelievable, really. And people, it's Howard Schultz. And who's the guy, the Whole Foods guy, John Mackey, I think, right? And I don't know, maybe I'm dating myself, Rania, but I think you can probably remember in like the late 90s, the whole kind of Whole Foods, Starbucks, like a new kind of capitalist kind of thing. And now we're seeing they're just like all the old capitalists doing all the same old stuff.
It's like the tech guys. It's like the tech guys are like, we're going to remake the world, Twitter and Facebook. And then they just end up being like the same exact like oligarchs that we've always had, just a little dorkier, I guess. I don't know, like whatever you want to.
With a better website, I guess.
With a better website, yeah.
But yeah, Schultz is saying he, under no circumstances, will come to the table, under no circumstances will bargain. Now, believe me, there's a lot of bosses that said that before and been made to eat their words, and I think he will this time. But it shows the importance, I think, of people showing that they support all the union efforts, wherever they may be. If you hear about people who are unionizing in Starbucks or anywhere, quite frankly, help them, support them, put some pressure on them. Speaking of unions, speaking of communities and workers united, we want to turn to a very, very important issue as we get into the school years beginning all across the country here, and that is the teacher shortage and the overall crisis in public education in the United States. And we are very honored to be joined for this conversation by Nathalie Hrizi, who's a public school teacher, public school librarian, and currently the vice president of substitutes with the United Educators of San Francisco. Nathalie, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me on. It's really exciting to talk to you both.
Well, we're really excited to have you. I think a lot of people, certainly anyone with kids, has been hearing about this issue of a teacher shortage in the United States as we go into the fall here in the new school year. And, but I know there's also now some pushback saying there is no teacher shortage. And that seems ridiculous, but there is pushback, I guess. So maybe just to start, give us some sense of what districts are facing, your district and elsewhere around the country in terms of going into this school year vis-a-vis appropriate staffing.
Yeah, I'll speak to specifics of the district. So I teach in San Francisco Unified School District and and elected to represent. It's a pretty urban district, not huge, right? We serve about 48 to 50,000 students with about 6,200 educators. And we were starting the year off hundreds of educators short. And there is a distinction to be made. I think people talk about teachers a lot, but there's a lot of people who work in education. So we were over 140 teachers short, but then almost 200 paraeducators short. And paraeducators play critical roles, one-on-one student work, security, family work, all sorts of different roles are played in the education world by paraeducators. So that's hundreds and hundreds of workers who, are not able to serve those kids. And I think that our experience is probably replicated across the country. In some places it's much worse, in some places it's slightly better, but we are definitely seeing that trend across the country.
And no, indeed. More than 500,000 teachers have left teaching in the last year and a half. I'm curious if you can maybe talk a little bit about why there is this teacher shortage now. Obviously, a lot of this has to do with COVID and what happened after the pandemic, but this is also a part of a decades long, I think, attack on public education. And maybe the pandemic was kind of the last straw for a lot of people. But can you speak to why so many teachers have left the profession in recent years?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think you hit the nail on the head. The pandemic was this expansion of what we were all already experiencing in public education. And I'll speak to the pandemic first. What we experienced as educators in the pandemic was that for the health of our communities, for the health of our families, we pivoted and began to do education in a way no one had ever considered it before. And educators, it was exhausting, it was, demoralizing and alienating in a lot of ways. So just that experience within the pandemic was very, very challenging. And it came at a time with very little political support and often political attacks as the pandemic carried on. And the government provided no real support for individuals. What we really saw in our schools, we see it in the Board of Education races and the way educators were spoken about. I think people turned on each other. They turned, right? That real angst and anxiety became something that we then had to contend with as educators who are trying to do our best in a very difficult situation. And I could speak about that for a long time, but I think what it did was made, sort of heightened a demoralization and a feeling of a lack of respect for a profession that you go to college for, and then you go to additional schooling for, and you come out with quite a bit of debt. And you're in that situation as an individual, and you're experiencing it. But what you said about the last 10 years, and I would argue even longer than that, is that there has been a sustained attack on public education since the late 80s. It was really high, started in the late 80s, but rolled all the way through, and we experienced it in the attempts to underfund education, to promote charter schools, to pull kids out of public education, and really as an attack on our unions, which is the collective voice of our educators in those spaces that speaks not just for us, but for our students as well. And we've seen that develop. And that attack on public education has led to a place where I'm sure everyone's seen, the map of teacher pay penalty, where Colorado teachers are paid 35% less than the rest of the country. Here in California, it's more like 16 to 17%. But this idea that your other college-educated professionals are being paid far more in wages and compensation than you are for something that people value. Everyone loves their teachers. Everyone loves, you have teachers who were really important to you. Every time we go and do political lobbying, that politician says to us, well, my mom was a teacher, my cousin was a teacher. Everyone loves their teachers, but the society we live in doesn't actually invest in public education or the educators that make it happen.
I think that's such a good point, because I think it really puts it into context. I mean, sort of what we value as a society and what it says about the politics of a society that we could even be here. I mean, and of course, this is the enemies of public education are always saying, oh, these teachers are just greedy. Oh, they're doing this, doing that. But, one thing I always say to people when they're talking about, oh, I hated this thing on CNN, I hated this thing on Fox, I hated this thing on MSNBC, is I'm like, well, just think about that talking head and know they make 100 times more than any teacher in America. And people are always like, wow, I never thought about it like that. But it's sort of like the warped reality where it's like teachers are greedy somehow and schools are taking too much money. But no one's ever saying, isn't it weird that we're paying some random person like Chris Cillizza or Rachel Maddow or Tucker Carlson $20 million, $10 million, $15 million to just randomly talk about things on TV. I mean, it really does feel like so much of the rhetoric against teachers and against public schools is really rooted in this idea that somehow public services, social good is pernicious or something. I don't know. I'm rambling, but maybe just your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think that's a really critical point. I mean, we spoke out at the Board of Education meeting just this last night. I'm forgetting what day it is, but it was last night, or 2 nights ago, sorry. And, we had paraeducators get up and talk about what it's like to live in San Francisco when, the cost of living is so high that you really need to make like $39 to $45 an hour for a living wage. We're not talking 15, like more than twice that. And paraeducators make, $24,000 to $28,000 a year, and they're trying to do their best, but they can't even live, not only in the communities their kids live in, but the city that their kids live in. And then what does that mean? And the idea that teachers get into this for the money is such a falsity. It should be laughable. No one should be able to repeat that without just being ridiculed, because it's never been true. But at this moment, I think what we're facing is that the crisis in public education can be turned around. Like, it could have been turned around 10 years ago, but no one did anything about it. The de-investment in public education, the de-investment in colleges that educate teachers, those were all things that were happening. And the only thing that shifted it actually were the 2018 teacher strikes. That was when the whole de-investment started to shift, but it was so late. And now this crisis is so present for everyone that I think we do have an opportunity to change the crisis. And, the teachers' unions are at the forefront of that struggle. The Columbus, Ohio teachers are on strike right now. And when you look at what they're asking for, it speaks to this. It speaks to revitalizing and stabilizing our educator population so that we can be in the classrooms with our kids, teaching at a very, very critical time for everyone, for an entire society. The pandemic is not over. Of course, we see that, but we are able to be back in the classrooms. We are able to be fully present with our students and our communities. And this is kind of a key moment in that struggle to shift what has been going on for many decades.
And it's also like, that is the positive side of this. It's also just so unfortunate because in the process, there are these trained professionals who have college degrees, who've studied this, who are now no longer in the profession, and you can't rebuild that overnight. So it's important what you're saying, that it's like waiting till 2018 to sort of like reverse the deinvestment is like too little too late in so many ways, because now you've lost like a whole almost like generation of people who aren't going to be teachers. And how do you even replace that? And I can't even imagine the stuff you guys have to deal with, because like on top of just, you know, being like the punching bag whenever the country's like in chaos and disarray, like during the pandemic, it's also like these other weird political culture war issues that come up, like around critical race theory. Somehow teachers end up at the center of it, and you've got teachers just being attacked by like an entire news network and like getting certain parents all revved up to like blame teacher. It's just, I can't even imagine. It's like, I mean, this is me just ranting now too, but just the insanity that teachers in America in public education have to deal with. And, you know, I have sisters who have kids, and then I hear them complain about like now their kids are, you know, at really good public schools. Some of the best funded public schools in the country have class sizes of like 30 and more. That's like the situation. And you can't, like you said, like you can't repair that overnight. You can fix it, but it's hard. It's hard and it's difficult after like all these years. And I do hope that reverses. Are you like optimistic? I guess that's a good segue. And are you optimistic about reversing that trend? And then also for those who are watching, what can be done? Like what can your average person do? I know that's a kind of a hard question, but to help in that effort.
Yeah, I will say that I am optimistic. I am optimistic because there is that challenge that you named is real. Like we've lost so many educators that just aren't coming back into the profession, right? But there are still people coming into the profession. Many of our new hires, not ours, but the district's new hires, were brand new professionals who are finishing their credential program. So it's not that the stream is completely ended. It's that we're in a very challenging position in regards to I guess the moment that needs to take advantage of. This is not the time to cut education funding. This is not the time to resume the attacks on public education. It's the time to actually double, triple, increase our funding and look at it as a whole system-wide issue. So fund teacher credentialing programs, get teachers into the classrooms, recruit from the communities that our kids are in, like really take advantage of this moment to turn towards funding public education. And I guess what I would say is that the thing I said earlier, there's a reverse, right? Like when we're talking to people who talk about always knowing a teacher, people know a lot of educators, right? You're either, I mean, I'm a parent myself. We, as parents, we know we can connect with our educators. We know how to. It's sort of our first point of contact. And I would say that's key. Like communities have to come back together. And what we've seen from educators across the country since 2018, but since before really, but 2018 really changed it, is the idea that when we fight, and what we say is we're fighting for the schools our students deserve. When we fight, that's what we're fighting for. And that means that we need our voices of our families. We need the voices of the communities in these struggles to turn this tide. So I would say get involved. Like if you're in Columbus right now, go join a picket line, be out there, connect with the educators who are there as best you can. And I think that's the first step anyone can take to becoming part of what could be a potentially very strong movement.
No, I think that's a really, really strong point. And in a way, I don't want to preface it, but I mean, it does make me think a lot about, something that I think teachers unions have put out in a huge way here, this concept of bargaining for the public good and how, fighting for public education is really fighting for everything. And I think, certainly I know it's what you all do at UESF. It's been a big part of the Chicago Teachers Union, where this fight for public education has become part of a bigger fight for public social goods. And that, like, you know what I mean? And sort of the school as a pivot point for talking about what kind of society and what kind of communities do we really want to have. And that, to me, that feels like a powerful connection to make in terms of how, public education as a foundation for our societies is a big part of talking about the future.
Absolutely. And what we've talked about is part of bargaining for the common good, and it's almost an expansion of that, is that when we are talking about the schools our students deserve, we're talking about community schools. And so this means that these are schools where you're fully staffed. You have the counselors, the psychologists, the social workers, the amount of paraeducators you need to be fully present in the educational, academic, and social well-being of your students, but it's beyond that. it incorporates the needs of those students' families and the community around it. So in one of our community schools here, they set up a homeless shelter on campus for homeless families that needed a place to live. Community schools are becoming more and more popular across the country. You can look at a variety of different districts that have very established community school programs, and they have this incredible boost to the academic development of our students, because when our kids come in hungry, we can't start with math. We have to start with what do they need to eat. And when they're homeless, we don't even know how to address that, right? Like, one educator, two educators in a classroom, what can you really do? We do our best, but that's the sort of situation. So bargaining for the common good, bringing the community to the bargaining table, and there's been some incredible wins, like you said, in Chicago, also in LA, also in San Diego, and in Minneapolis and Boston is sort of moving towards that as well in pretty impressive ways. So we're seeing it, right? I think that's really what I was talking about, is how do we come together so that it's not just the community needs one thing, educators and students need another, but it's a holistic approach to ensuring that we really do meet the needs of our students.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's good to know that there are people out here in the front lines fighting for all of this, and we know our communities need a lot. Nathalie Hrizi, public school teacher, public school librarian, vice president of substitutes for the United Educators of San Francisco. Thanks for all your work, and thank you for giving us some of your very valuable time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.
Yes,
Well,
Rania.
she was
Go
excellent.
ahead.
She was excellent. No, I'm so happy with our guests today. I mean, always happy
Yes.
with our guests, but
You just took such a
was
long
definitely-
inhale. I didn't know if you were going to.
Like, if I was going to say, you go, girl.
Honestly, I got
Okay.
scared.
I got.
I did.
Yeah, I'm trying to refrain to one silly thing every show. I think I think I told you, what did I say in the beginning? It's the
I've already
privilege of
forgotten.
my
Trauma
life.
block.
Oh, God. No, but excellent show today. I hope we can come back to the issue of Pakistan. We ran into some, I think, technical
Some technical difficulties, unfortunately, there. Czar Imran was trying to join us, doing the best he could, had some technical issues. If when you see this later, I'm sure Mr. Imran would appreciate you giving it a shot. And we will circle back around. A lot happening in Pakistan. I won't get into it now because we want to watch it. This will, of course, bring us to the end of the show here. As always, just want to remind people, you can always go to patreon.com/breakthrough-news. That's patreon.com/breakthrough-news and become a patron. And of course, all of your patronage is greatly appreciated. Plays a
can't see
big
me.
role in helping us push that forward.
I just realized you can't see me today.
Yeah.
And I just pointed at the Patreon. I pointed down,
Great.
and it
Perfect.
I wish you were there to see it.
I'm sorry,
I
I
wish you
could
could
now
have
have to go
seen.
back and watch it.
Yeah, you'll have to go back
also,
and
check out our new
watch.
website, by the way, at breakthroughnews.org, where there's a donate tab. So definitely
We have
do
a new
that.
look.
I guess do whatever
We have a
Rania's
new
pointing at on the screen.
Well, I'm not pointing anymore, but we do have a fantastic new look. Shout out to like the whole design team, everybody who's been working on the website. It looks fantastic. New
Yes.
logo, a little touch of different color than we had before. Just new look overall. I think it looks fantastic, and I hope you guys do too. And the whole website has the look as well. So you absolutely have to go check out breakthroughnews.org.
Absolutely. And shout out to Matt Boleyn, the host of the new segment of the Freedom Side, State of the Struggle. Look for it every week moving forward when we join you here on the Freedom Side, Thursdays, 3 p.m. Eastern Time here in the United States. That'll do it for us this week. But for myself, for Rania, we will see you next Thursday.